Liberty, equality, fraternity. 3 words born in the smoke and fire of revolutionary Paris that promised to reshape the modern world. They were meant to be universal, elite for all of humanity to follow. But as those words were being carved into the stone of French cathedrals, they were also travelling. They crossed the salt-heavy winds of the Atlantic. They moved through the humid heat of the Caribbean. They followed the winding ancient rivers of Africa and the deep, silent jungles of Asia. And yet, for the millions who lived under the tricolor flag in those distant lands, these words were often just a whisper or a ghost. France spoke of freedom from its gilded salons, while its reach extended thousands of miles to rule with an iron grip. It promised a world of equals, yet it built a reality of rigid hierarchies. It claimed a brotherhood of man, but that brotherhood often stopped at the shoreline of Europe. This is the story of a profound human paradox, the story of a nation that taught the world how to question power, even as it was building one of the largest colonial empires the world had ever seen. Before we begin this journey, if you enjoy these unhurried stories, I'd be honoured to have you subscribe to the channel, and please leave a comment with your city and the time you're listening. I'd love to check your comments. But for now, let the sounds of the modern world fade. Let the glow of the screen and the noise of the present recede into the background. We're travelling back far beyond the reach of the revolutionary streets, to a time when the maps were still mostly blank, and the ocean was a mystery waiting to be solved. Empires are not born in the thunder of battle. They are born in the quiet moments when a nation first dares to look beyond the horizon. Long before the tricolour flag was planted in distant soil, before the cannon spoke or the lines on the maps hardened into borders, there was a season of stillness. It was a pause in history, a time when the scholars in Paris and the merchants in Marseille stood at the very edge of the known world and looked out toward the endless rolling blue of the Atlantic. This was the age of discovery, a time when the sea itself seemed to wake up. Wooden ships held together by hemp rope and the scent of pine tar creaked beneath stars that no European astronomer had yet named. Their sails caught winds that carried more than just salt. They carried rumours of cities paved in gold, of rivers that ran forever, and of lands that no parchment map could fully contain. Across the continent, the horizon had transformed from a boundary into an invitation. But France was not the first to answer. To the south, Spain and Portugal had already claimed the dawn. Their heavy galleons moved with a growing confidence across the deep, carving invisible paths through the waves. In the ports of Seville and Lisbon, the air was thick with the scent of new wealth, heavy sacks of peppercorns, raw sugar, and the cold clink of silver from the Americas. Their kings spoke of distant kingdoms as if they were mere rooms in their own palaces. The seas, it seemed, already had their masters. France, meanwhile, watched from the shore. For centuries, France had been a power of the earth, not the water. Its heart beat in the fertile fields of the Loire Valley and the fortified castles of the interior. Power was measured in the depth of a moat, the strength of an army, and land held close to home. To the French mind, empire meant Europe itself. And yet, the world was shifting beneath their feet. In the taverns of Saint-Malo and Le Havre, stories began to drift in, like the tide. They were carried by sailors with faces weathered by sun and salt, eyes restless from looking at too much open space. They spoke of the new world not as a map, but as a sensation. They described forests so thick the sun never touched the ground, and coastlines where the trees met the ocean in a tangle of green and foam. They spoke of the great fishing banks off Newfoundland, where the cod were so thick you could almost walk upon their backs. France faced a quiet, monumental question. Should they remain rooted in the familiar, heavy soil of Europe, competing endlessly with neighbours who knew their every move? Or should they look outward, toward the great uncertainty of the West, and risk everything on the open sea? There was no grand decree, no single day when King Francis I decided to build an empire. Instead, it happened slowly, almost gently, as curiosity began to outweigh the ancient caution of the crown. A single ship commissioned here, a small expedition funded there. French sailors stepped aboard vessels that were never meant for comfort. They lived in the smell of wet wool, oakum, and salted beef. The wood groaned and complained beneath them with every swell. These men like Giovanni da Verrazzano and Jacques Cartier, were not yet conquerors, they were seekers. As they sailed into waters that held no memory of them, they began to trace the jagged edges of a new reality. They followed coastlines that bent away from Europe, drawing new, tentative shapes onto the margins of the world. They entered the mouths of rivers that seemed to pull them inland, deeper into a continent that felt impossibly vast, impossibly silent. There was fear in those early journeys. There were storms that could erase weeks of progress in a single night of howling wind. There was the gnawing ache of hunger that made men doubt their very purpose, and a silence so deep it seemed to press against the soul. But there was wonder too, the first sight of land after 40 days of nothing but grey water, the meeting of peoples whose languages sounded like the wind through the trees, whose customs were as ancient as the earth itself. It was the realization that the world was far larger and far more intricate than any European map had ever dared to suggest. France's first steps were fragile. These were not armies. They were small clusters of men shivering in unfamiliar climates, trying to understand the rhythm of the seasons. They built temporary shelters of timber. They traded knives and beads for furs, and they learned the hard lessons of the wilderness when they were wise enough to listen. This was not yet an empire of control. It was an empire of questions. What could be taken? What could be shared? What could be endured? At this stage, France did not command the global trade winds. They lingered in the long shadow of Spanish power, watching, learning, and waiting. But a seed had been planted. In that quiet space between curiosity and ambition, a path had opened. It was a path that would eventually stretch across centuries, bringing unimaginable wealth and profound suffering, pride and regret, connection and conflict. This empire would one day span the globe, and one day it would begin to slip away. The French colonial empire did not begin with a shout of victory. It began with the choice to leave the shore behind, and the quiet acceptance that once a nation leaves the harbour, it is never quite the same again. From these first uncertain voyages, our story now moves forward, slowly, carefully, into the deep forests and cold rivers of a new world. It is there that France would attempt to plant its roots far from home and discover just how fragile a dream of ambition can truly be. The journey continues. The ocean did not lead France to a city of gold, nor to the spice markets of the East. Instead, it led them to the mouth of a river. After those first hesitant crossings, French hulls began to return more frequently to the grey, churning waters of the North Atlantic. They were drawn toward the jagged edges of a continent where the coastline broke into 1,000 hidden inlets, and where the air was no longer salt-misted, but heavy with the scent of ancient pine and the sharp, clean promise of snow. Here, explorers like Jacques Cartier were searching for more than just a quick fortune. They were looking for a passage to the Orient, yes, but what they found was something far more enduring, a foothold in a world that did not yet have a name on their maps. There was no illusion of ease in these northern reaches. The men who stood on the damp decks of those early ships were under no spell of romanticism. They arrived cautious and observant, Their eyes narrowed against the biting winds. They knew, perhaps better than any who came after, that survival in this land depended entirely on a delicate balance of patience and courage. Then they found the St. Lawrence. It opened before them not just as a body of water, but as a gateway to the heart of a continent. It was wide, steady, and deceptively calm, its current pulling the French deeper into a wilderness that few Europeans could have even dreamed of. Along its banks, the forests didn't just grow, they dominated. They stretched endlessly toward the horizon, an unbroken sea of green and grey, disturbed only by the rising smoke of indigenous villages, communities that had mastered these rhythms long before a French sail ever appeared on the water. The river did not fight the French, but it did not welcome them either. It simply existed, massive and indifferent. From these riverbanks emerged the fragile, splintering beginnings of what would be called New France. These were not grand cities of stone and marble. They were outposts built of raw timber and a desperate kind of hope. Quebec began as little more than a collection of wooden huts clinging to the side of a massive cliff, a vulnerable point of survival overlooking the water. Montreal followed, less a triumph of architecture, and more a gritty experiment in human endurance. Life in these early years was defined by the cold. The winters in the St. Lawrence Valley did not arrive. They descended. They stayed long after the calendar said they should be gone. The cold wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical weight that seeped into the bones and settled in the spirit. Crops planted in hope often failed in the rocky soil. Ships carrying vital supplies from France were often delayed by Atlantic storms or blocked by thick ice floes, arriving months late or sometimes not at all. Scurvy and fever moved through the small settlements like ghosts, testing whether these newcomers would survive another season or simply vanish into the silence of the woods. France had planted its roots, but the earth was frozen and hard. It soon became clear that survival would not come through the edge of a sword or the thunder of a cannon. It would come through the quiet work of relationships. The indigenous peoples, the Huron-Wendat, the Algonquin, the Innu, knew this land with an intimacy that the French could barely grasp. They understood the language of the tracks in the snow, the migration of the great herds, and the secret paths through the rapids. For the French, these alliances were the only path forward. Trade replaced the dream of conquest. Cooperation became the currency of survival. Beaver furs, thick and warm, began to flow through ancient indigenous trade networks, reaching French hands in exchange for iron kettles, wool blankets, and steel knives. French traders, the coureurs de bois, stepped carefully into this world. They did not try to pave it. They tried to learn it. They adapted their dress, their food, and their very way of moving through the world. They learned which river bends led to safety and which led to a quiet disappearance. These early days were a fragile dance. Misunderstandings often simmered beneath the surface of shared meals and signed treaties. Two worlds, separated by vast oceans of history and belief, were forced to meet under the heavy pressure of necessity. Yet, compared to the violent upheavals happening further south, France's early presence remained measured and deeply dependent on those who were there before them. New France did not explode into growth. There were no teeming crowds or bustling streets. Instead, expansion moved at the pace of a canoe. Trading posts appeared like small, lonely lanterns in the dark, isolated and always a little bit afraid. Every choice carried the weight of life or death. Where to build a cabin? Whom to trust in the deep woods? How do you balance your loyalty to a king 3,000 miles away with the immediate gnawing reality of hunger and isolation? The French who stayed began to change. They were no longer quite the same people who had left the ports of France. They were being reshaped by the vastness of the land, the bite of the winter, and the silence of the Great Lakes. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the uncertainty remained. Would the French crown commit to this frozen dream, or would New France remain a scattered collection of huts, always one bad winter away from being reclaimed by the forest? The answer was not yet written, but a truth had settled into the mud of the St. Lawrence. France was no longer a visitor. It had unpacked its tools. It had buried its dead. It was staying. And with that choice came a ripple of consequences that would draw France deeper into the heart of the Americas, into a future of immense wealth and bitter contradiction, of lasting alliances and devastating wars. The river continued to flow, cold and indifferent, as the story of France in the world began to widen. What began as a fragile struggle for survival along a cold northern river slowly transformed into something broader, heavier, and far more complex. Quebec and Montreal did not just survive, they endured. Season after season, these outposts remained standing, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because the roots had grown too deep to pull. Their wooden walls were repaired again and again, scarred by the bite of the frost and the char of the hearth fire. These were no longer temporary shelters raised in a moment of doubt. They had become places of routine, small quiet towns defined by the steady rhythmic movement of the St. Lawrence River, and the vast silent distance that separated them from the streets of Paris. In the north, life remained harsh, but it grew familiar. The arrival of winter was no longer a surprise, it was a certainty. Snow pressed heavily against the cedar-shingled rooftops, and the rivers froze into a deep crystalline silence. Families formed, slowly their bonds forged in the shared hardship of the long winter. Children grew up knowing the language of the forest better than the layout of a city street. In the crisp air, church bells rang out, their sound carrying for miles across the snow-covered ground. A reminder that even when the world felt paused by ice, time and faith still moved forward. The French language took root here, not carried by the force of an army, but by the repetition of daily life. It was spoken over bowls of steaming broth, whispered in evening prayers, and passed down to generations who would likely never see the shores of Europe. New France was not a mirror of Paris. It was something quieter, a culture shaped by the necessity of the wilderness. From these northern anchors, France's reach began to stretch outward. Explorers followed the waterways deeper into the heart of the continent, guided by the realization that in this new world, rivers were the only true roads. Water offered a passage, where the ancient forests resisted. Canoes, light and agile, moved where horses could never tread. Every bend in a river revealed a new uncertainty, sometimes a promise of fertile land, sometimes only the deep silence of the unknown. As they moved southward, the world began to shift. The air softened. The jagged pines of the north gave way to the broad leaves of the south. The river system widened into the Mississippi, a vast, slow-moving artery that connected the icy interior to the warm, salt-scented waters of the Gulf. This vision became Louisiana. Unlike the settlements of the north, Louisiana was built on an idea of grand influence. On maps, it appeared confident and inevitable, bold lines suggesting a French corridor that bisected the entire continent. But in reality, Louisiana remained fragile. Its settlements, like the young New Orleans, were thinly populated and constantly tested by humidity, tropical disease, and the sheer scale of the distance between outposts. Authority travelled slowly here. Supplies were often lost to the sea or the swamp. Louisiana survived not because it was mastered, but because it was believed in, maintained as a grand strategic dream as much as a physical place. And then there was the Caribbean. Here, the story of the French Empire shifted into a different, darker tone. The islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue did not demand endurance in the way the North did. They did not test a man with cold, but with the speed of wealth. The volcanic soil and the endless growing seasons reshaped every expectation. Sugar became possible, and sugar reshaped everything it touched. Plantations spread across the islands, their fields heavy with the green stalks of cane. The rhythm of life moved quickly here, driven by the frantic pace of the harvest and the sight of merchant ships waiting in the harbours. But these ships carried more than just supplies. They carried human lives bound in chains. Enslaved Africans were forced into a system designed not for settlement or community, but for pure extraction. Their labour powered the massive stone mills that crushed the cane, producing a flow of white gold that crossed the Atlantic to enrich the ports of Nantes and Bordeaux. The empire now felt powerful, but that power was built on a profound contradiction. In the north, France appeared adaptive and restrained, dependent on alliances with indigenous nations and the slow pace of the fur trade. But in the Caribbean, the empire was unsparing and industrial. The same nation that learned to listen to the rhythms of the frozen rivers relied on a system that stripped people of their humanity beneath a tropical sun. The comfort found in a Parisian cafe rested directly on the unrelenting suffering in a distant cane field. These contradictions were not hidden. They were simply accepted as the cost of greatness. Empire demanded results, and wealth demanded sacrifice. The distance of the ocean allowed the conscience to soften, turning the reality of the plantations into abstract numbers on a ledger. The French Americas were not one story but three. Quebec and Montreal were the reminders of patience. Louisiana was the shadow of ambition. The Caribbean was the engine of wealth and cruelty. Together they formed a continental web, uneven, interconnected, and increasingly visible to a watching world. But the land was not empty, and the French were not alone. To the east, the British Empire watched the French rivers and ports with a growing, cold concern. Ambition was pressing against ambition. The Americas had become crowded with desire, and the quiet curiosity of the early explorers had turned into a fierce global competition. In time, that competition would ask for a reckoning. The river routes, the plantations, and the lonely outposts were all drawing France toward a conflict that would test the very soul of the empire. As France's presence in the Americas widened, it did not do so in a vacuum. Across the Atlantic world, another power watched from the rocky coastlines of New England and the bustling ports of New York. Britain, much like France, had come to realize that the true measure of a kingdom no longer rested solely on the soil of Europe. Power now followed the deep-water sea lanes, the lucrative trade routes, and the possession of distant, resource-rich colonies. In this new global contest for space, there was simply no room for two such vast ambitions to grow side by side. The rivalry between the French and the British was an ancient one, shaped by centuries of dynastic wars and deep-seated distrust across the English Channel. But here, in the vastness of the Americas, the struggle took on a new, more visceral character. This was not a war of kings in polished palaces. It was a struggle over the control of the great fur-trading arteries, the strategic ports of the Atlantic, and the sugar-rich islands of the Caribbean. It was a contest over who would shape the future of a continent that neither side truly understood. The colonies became the distant limbs of a European struggle, stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. In the dense, shadow-filled forests of North America, French and British interests began to edge closer and closer together. Their boundaries were vague, drawn by men in London and Paris who had never seen the Ohio River or the Great Lakes. In the Caribbean, islands like Martinique and St. Lucia changed hands like pieces on a gambling table, each one valued for the dark, profitable sweetness of its sugar and the strategic shelter of its harbours. Even in the distant waters of the Indian Ocean, similar tensions were simmering, as both empires sought to plant their flags wherever the trade winds blew. The world had become a battlefield, but for a long time it was a quiet one. That silence was eventually shattered by the conflict we now call the 7 Years' War. It was not a sudden eruption, but rather the result of years of mounting pressure. A slow-burning fuse lit in the backcountry of the Ohio Valley. What began as small skirmishes between scouts and fur traders slowly drew the full might of two global empires into an open, unrelenting war. For New France, the stakes were nothing short of existence. The French settlements in North America were vast in their reach, stretching from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the mouth of the Mississippi, but they were incredibly fragile in their population. There were few hands to hold so much land. Defence depended almost entirely on the intricate web of alliances with indigenous nations and the natural rugged barriers of the earth itself. Against them stood the British colonies, 13 separate territories that were more numerous, more heavily supplied, and increasingly confident in their own strength. The war in the wilderness was unlike anything seen on the plains of Europe. It was a war of la petite guerre, the little war. It was the slow tension of scouts moving through trees that stood too still, of rivers carrying the faint sound of a paddle stroke further than expected, and of morning fogs that turned the world into a grey, unreadable ghost. Small timber forts, like Fort Duquesne or Ticonderoga, became lonely islands of anxiety in a sea of green. To the men stationed there, French regulars in their white coats, local militia and their indigenous allies, the war was a series of questions asked with every step into the brush. Will we return? Will we be seen? Will we be remembered? In the forest, victory rarely arrived with the roar of a crowd. More often, it arrived as the simple mercy of survival. One more night without an ambush, one more supply canoe slipping through the darkness of a river bend, one more dawn that didn't begin with the sharp crack of a flintlock. Loss was equally quiet. A patrol that never came back. A storehouse, burned to ash in the night. A message that vanished somewhere in the 300 miles of trackless woods between outposts. The war moved through the landscape like a season, persistent, indifferent, and cold. As the struggle deepened, British naval power began to tighten its grip on the Atlantic. Out at sea, the war became something colder and more decisive. The British Royal Navy began to block the horizon. For the people of Quebec and Montreal, ships did not just carry gunpowder and lead. They carried the very essence of home. They carried letters from families in Normandy, barrels of salt pork, and the medicines needed to survive the winter. As the ocean narrowed under British control, New France began to feel like a room where the door was slowly, inevitably closing. Each month grew a little quieter. Each season, the colony felt a little more alone. The St. Lawrence River still flowed, wide and indifferent, but the world beyond the Gulf grew harder and harder to reach. Isolation does not shatter a place all at once. It wears it down, like the steady drip of water on a limestone cliff. A colony can endure the hunger of a failed harvest. It can endure the bitterest cold. But it struggles against the growing, hollow feeling that no one is coming to help. French ships, battered by storms and hunted by British frigates, struggled to reach the St. Lawrence. Reinforcements arrived too late, or were lost to the depths of the sea. What had once been a vast distance now became a suffocating isolation, and isolation eventually turned into weakness. In the north, the heart of the empire began to feel the strain. Quebec, perched high atop the cliffs of Cape Diamond, stood as the final symbol of French endurance. Its survival had always been a matter of grit, but now that uncertainty turned into a shadow that hung over every street and every home. The city was no longer just a settlement. It was the final thread holding the entire vision of a French America together. By the time the British fleet arrived in force, Quebec felt less like a fortress and more like a last breath held in the lungs of a dying dream. Above the river, the grey stone walls and the steep tin rooftops stood against the sky with a stubborn, mournful silence. The St. Lawrence below, once the road of all French possibility, now carried the weight of 1,000 British masts. Inside the walls, the routines of life shortened. People spoke in lower voices. The nights grew longer as the fuel for lanterns ran low. Even the ordinary sounds of the city, the clatter of a cart on the cobblestones, the ringing of a convent bell seemed to pause, as if the very air was listening for the sound of the first cannon. And when the end came, on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, it did not feel like a sudden storm. It felt like the inevitable turn of a long, heavy season. In a short, bloody span of minutes, the dream of a French North America narrowed until it rested entirely on the fate of one vulnerable city beside an indifferent river. When Quebec fell, it did so with a quiet finality. The loss of the city marked more than just a tactical defeat. It was the unravelling of a dream that had taken nearly 2 centuries to build. The vast network of influence, the trading posts in the Illinois country, the forts on the Great Lakes, the alliances in the Ohio Valley, began to dissolve. The St. Lawrence continued to flow, but the flags along its banks had changed. France had lost its first colonial empire. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, a document that codified the collapse. France emerged from the conflict diminished, forced to hand over nearly all of its North American territories to Britain. The empire that had once stretched from the subarctic forests to the tropical delta now existed mostly in the memories of those who had lived there. Only fragments remained. A few islands in the Caribbean still produced their dark wealth. A few tiny outposts like Saint-Pierre and Miquelon remained as lonely markers in the Atlantic. But the continental vision, the grand idea of a French America connected by water and blood, was gone. For the people of France, the loss left a deep, aching wound. It reshaped their priorities and hardened their hearts against their British rivals. It planted a seed of doubt about the cost of distant lands. In the Americas, the former subjects of the King of France had to learn to live under a new crown, while in Paris the defeat lingered as a silent grievance, waiting for a moment to be redressed. The first French colonial empire had risen slowly, born of curiosity and the quiet rustle of beaver pelts. It fell in the smoke of a global conflict it could no longer control, and as the world moved forward, France stood once again at a crossroads, forced to look at the map and decide what kind of power it wanted to be in an age where the old rules of kings and colonies were about to be rewritten. The collapse of France's first colonial empire left behind more than just empty spots on a map. It left behind a heavy, lingering uncertainty. Across the heart of France itself, the old order, the Ancien Régime, still looked as though it were carved in permanent stone. Kings still held court at Versailles, nobles still moved through gilded halls of inherited privilege, and the word empire remained a polished symbol of national prestige. But beneath that glittering surface, the foundation was beginning to crack. A quiet pressure was moving through the cobblestone streets of Paris and the dusty villages of the countryside alike. Hunger was no longer a guest. It was a permanent resident. Debt, accumulated from decades of global warfare, sat heavy on the crown. Resentment settled into the daily rhythm of life, slow and persistent, like the low rumble of a storm that has not yet broken, but is surely gathering just beyond the horizon. The ground was shifting, even if few yet understood how far the fall would be. Then the revolution arrived. It did not come with a polite knock. It came with the sound of thousands of feet marching on the Bastille. The French Revolution unsettled every assumption that had held the world together for centuries. Authority that once felt as eternal as the stars dissolved with a startling, terrifying speed. The monarchy fell, and with it the idea that a person's worth was determined by their birth. In its place rose a deafening roar of voices demanding liberté, égalité, fraternity, liberty, equality, brotherhood. Power shifted from the throne to the streets, then to the assembly, then back again, uncertain, unstable, and restless. What had once been unquestioned was suddenly debated in every tavern. What had once been inherited was suddenly challenged by the edge of a blade, and across the vast rolling grey of the Atlantic the shockwaves began to spread. For generations, France's colonies had depended entirely on the absolute authority of the crown. Governors ruled not by their own merit, but in the name of a king thousands of miles away. The laws that governed the islands and the outposts were anchored in the tradition of monarchy. Distance had always been a tool of power. It allowed decisions made in the quiet offices of Paris to feel absolute and untouchable in lands far across the sea. But when that royal anchor was cut loose in the streets of Paris, the empire began to tremble. In the colonies, questions surfaced that could no longer be silenced by a governor's decree. Who holds the power now? Who speaks with the true voice of France? And if all men are born free and equal, then who is free and who is still in chains? Nowhere did these questions carry a more explosive weight than in the Caribbean. The plantation colonies, the jewels of the French treasury, had been built on a foundation of enforced silence. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people laboured within a system designed to strip them of their names, their voices, and their very identities. Order was maintained through a brutal routine of labour, the constant threat of the lash, and the psychological distance from any hope of change. For 100 years, any spark of resistance had been crushed long before it could find the air to breathe. Yet the ideas born in the smoke of revolutionary France did not stop at the water's edge. They were carried in the holds of merchant ships. They were tucked into the pockets of sailors. They were hidden in the margins of smuggled pamphlets. Ideas of universal rights and the dignity of the individual arrived quietly. They arrived in whispers passed between rows of sugarcane at dusk. They arrived in rumours carried along the trade routes from the docks of Le Cap. They arrived in fragments of speech overheard in the big houses, remembered in the dark and repeated in the secret language of the oppressed. They arrived as hope. Acts of defiance began to flicker across the Caribbean, not all at once and not always in the open. But those who lived within the crushing contradictions of the empire understood the irony better than any philosopher in Paris. How could France speak of liberty while keeping the hold of a slave ship full? How could equality exist alongside the iron collar? In the colony of Saint-Domingue, the most profitable piece of land on earth, that contradiction finally reached its breaking point. It deepened from a murmur into a revolution. What followed would become the Haitian Revolution, though to the watching world at the time, it felt like the world was turning upside down. Enslaved men and women rose against a system that had defined their lives through agony. The rigid order of the plantations dissolved into ash. The old hierarchies built on the myth of racial superiority collapsed under the weight of a people who refused to be property any longer. Force that had been suppressed for centuries moved into the light, not as random chaos, but as the inevitable release of a long simmering pressure. France, locked in its own internal struggle, was paralysed. The revolution at home had weakened the hand of the empire abroad. Factions in Paris argued over the colonial question, while the colonies burned. Ideals were proclaimed in the morning and withdrawn by nightfall. Promises of abolition were offered to win allies, then reshaped, then broken. Control slipped through the fingers of the generals. New leaders emerged from the soil of Saint-Domingue. Figures like Toussaint Louverture, men shaped not by royal blood, but by strategic genius, unyielding endurance, and the hard-won resolve of those who have nothing left to lose but their chains. The Haitian Revolution was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not a simple colonial skirmish. It was a declaration to the stars that the ideal spoken in the salons of Europe carried consequences far beyond Europe's shores. It proved that freedom, once named, could not be kept in a box made of parchment and philosophy. It belonged to the air itself. In time, Haiti would emerge as an independent nation, the first of its kind, born from the total overthrow of a slave system. It stood as a towering symbol of what was possible, and a quiet, terrifying warning to every empire that remained. For France, the loss was a staggering blow. Saint-Domingue had been the engine of their economy. Its sugar and coffee had built the mansions of Nantes and fueled the rise of the French merchant class. Losing it was a financial catastrophe, but more than that, it was a moral reckoning that the nation was not yet ready to face. Across the Atlantic world, the balance had shifted forever. Colonial rulers in other empires grew uneasy, watching the horizon for the first signs of smoke. Enslaved populations everywhere listened more closely to the wind. Ideas of freedom were now travelling faster than the fastest frigate, carried through shared memory and shared suffering. The old relationship between the mother country and the colony had been fractured in a way that could never be repaired. The empire was standing on shifting sand. As the revolutionary era continued, France searched for a way to stop the bleeding, seeking a leader who could restore order and redefine what it meant to be an empire. But the Atlantic world would never return to the silence of the old days. Freedom had entered the conversation, and once it had been spoken aloud, neither empire nor monarchy could ever truly be the same again. Out of the smoke and blood of the revolution, a new figure rose, quiet at first, a soldier from a rugged island, then suddenly unmistakable. Napoleon Bonaparte did not inherit a stable nation. He stepped into a France that was physically and spiritually exhausted by a decade of upheaval. The country was surrounded by old monarchies eager to see the revolution fail. Its borders were under threat, and its internal future was a tangled web of uncertainty. In this chaos, Napoleon offered a new language. He did not speak in the abstract dreams of philosophers. He spoke in the language of order and strength. Under his hand, France began to steady itself, even as the echoes of the guillotine still seemed to linger in the quiet corners of the Parisian streets. But with stability came a massive, restless ambition. Napoleon understood power as a tangible thing, military, political, and deeply symbolic. He looked at the maps in his study and saw that while France was once again becoming a master of the European continent, it was a ghost on the global stage. The memory of the lost colonies in North America, the forests of the north and the great river valleys, had not faded. It lingered like a story that had been cut short, a book closed before the final chapter was written. To Napoleon, that story was a temptation. For a brief moment, a revival seemed almost within his grasp. Napoleon dreamed of rebuilding France's presence in the Americas, a Western empire that would rival the British. At the heart of this vision was Louisiana, a territory so vast it made France itself look like a small province. On the map spread across his desk, Louisiana appeared as a massive bridge, a corridor of influence that could link the sugar wealth of the Caribbean to the deep, untapped interior of the North American continent. But dreams are fragile things when they meet the hard reality of geography and war. France's grip on its Atlantic anchors was slipping. The revolution in Saint-Domingue had proven that the old world of plantation slavery could not simply be reclaimed by force. Napoleon sent a massive fleet and thousands of seasoned soldiers to the Caribbean, but they found an enemy they could not shoot: the climate. Yellow fever moved through the French camps like a silent executioner, claiming more lives than any battlefield ever could. Supply lines, stretched thin across a restless ocean, were easily harassed by British warships. Resistance in the colonies didn't just harden. It became a wall that France could not climb. At the same time, the earth of Europe was demanding everything France had to give. Conflict followed conflict. The Grande Armée was marching across the familiar muddy fields of Austria and Prussia, not through the distant jungles or the tall grass of the Mississippi. Every coin, every musket, and every young man was needed for the struggle at home, where victories felt immediate and survival felt urgent. The Atlantic Ocean, which the early explorers had treated as an invitation, once again became a wall. Napoleon was a master of land, but he was a student of the sea. For all his genius on the battlefield, he understood that the ocean was a space he could not command with a cavalry charge. On land, borders shifted beneath his boots, but across the Atlantic, time stretched and certainty thinned. Orders weakened as they travelled across the waves. Control dissolved into the delays of wind and tide. The ocean did not respond to his genius. It responded only to chance. Napoleon made a decision born of cold, hard realism, rather than imperial romance. In 1803, Louisiana was sold. The sale of Louisiana to the young United States was far more than a simple real estate transaction. It was a profound acknowledgement of limits. By letting that territory go for $15 million, France admitted that an empire cannot be held simply because it is drawn in ink on a map. The vast lands of the interior had proven too distant, too demanding, and too quiet to justify the cost of the blood and gold required to keep them. What had once been imagined as a bridge across a continent became instead a monument to what could not be done. The Louisiana Purchase was not a defeat in the traditional sense, but it was a quiet surrender of a future. France relinquished its last grand claim to a North American empire, trading a dream of land for the cold currency needed to fuel the wars Napoleon believed truly mattered, the wars for Europe. With that single stroke of a pen, the possibility of a French America vanished into history. France turned its gaze fully back to the continent. For Napoleon, empire became something forged in the iron of cannons and the dust of the road, not the spray of the sea. His world narrowed to the distance a soldier could march in a day. Overseas ambition did not disappear entirely, but it went into a long, deep sleep. The world beyond the shores of France remained distant and secondary, overshadowed by the titanic struggle for European dominance. The colonial future was placed on a shelf, neither fully abandoned nor actively pursued. When Napoleon's era finally came to an end on the lonely, windswept rock of St. Helena, he left behind a strange paradox. France was perhaps the most feared and influential nation in Europe, yet its footprint on the wider world was smaller than it had been in 200 years. The dream of a vast colonial revival had slipped away, not through a single catastrophic collapse, but through a series of pragmatic choices. Yet history is rarely satisfied with an ending that clean. The silence that followed was not a final stop. It was merely a breath. Beneath the surface of the post-Napoleonic world, the old desire for reach and prestige remained. It was waiting for a new moment, a new justification, and a new generation that would once again look toward the horizon and wonder what lay beyond. France had turned its back on the sea for a time, but the sea has a way of calling back to those who have once left the shore. The story was far from over. The silence that followed the final fall of Napoleon did not last forever. For a generation, France appeared to turn inward, its gaze fixed on its own wounded soil. The long, exhausting years of revolution and the thundering march of the empire faded into a collective memory, carried away by a weary nation that sought recovery rather than resolution. Across Europe, the lines of the maps shifted and settled into new arrangements. New powers, like a rising Prussia, began to emerge. Old rivalries, though never truly gone, softened into quieter, more diplomatic forms. As the 19th century unfolded, France slowly found its balance once more. The turbulence of past upheaval gave way to a quieter, sturdier confidence. The streets of Paris were rebuilt, narrow alleys widening into grand boulevards, and the institutions of the state began to steady themselves. Order returned, not as a sudden decree, but as a slow habit of daily life. And beneath that calm surface, one belief remained, untouched. The idea that a nation's greatness was still measured by its reach beyond the European continent. But this time, France looked outward with very different eyes. The age of hesitant exploration, of wooden ships wandering into unknown mists, had passed into history. This second era of empire would not be shaped by the uncertainty of the explorer or the fragile trading posts of the fur trapper. It would be deliberate, it would be organized, it would be lasting. Expansion was no longer an experiment tested by chance or the whims of a single sailor. It was now a policy of the state. Decisions were no longer made on the spray-slicked decks of ships, but in the quiet, high-ceilinged offices of the Ministry of the Marine and the Colonies. Authority travelled not through rumour or the hope of a distant passage, but through the scratch of a quill on official parchment, through paperwork, regulation and meticulous planning. Empire had become something designed in a bureau before it was ever discovered in the field. The focus shifted decisively away from the lost lands of the Americas. The lessons of loss had been learned there, perhaps too deeply to ever truly ignore. The great rivers of the north, once imagined as the silver roads of a French future, now belonged to others. The dreams of a continental reach across the Mississippi had dissolved into the dust of history. Instead, France turned its attention toward Africa and Asia, regions that were no longer seen as distant, mysterious worlds, but as spaces to be organized, structured, and brought under the firm hand of French authority. The world was being divided again, and France intended to secure its place in the new order. The conquest of Algeria in 1830 marked the beginning of this new chapter. What started as a limited military intervention, justified at the time by a diplomatic insult, unfolded slowly into a deep, unrelenting and permanent occupation. Algeria was not treated as a temporary possession to be managed from afar. It became something more intimate, a place meant to be held, reshaped, and woven directly into the fabric of French national identity. The process was neither swift nor was it gentle. Military columns moved steadily across the rugged terrain of North Africa, clearing paths for the administrators who followed. Resistance appeared almost immediately, shaped by the fierce attachment of the local people to their land and their faith. Each response from France grew firmer and more structured, reflecting a total commitment to staying. Over time, the soldier gave way to the settler. Land was remapped and retitled. Old patterns of life were overwritten by new, European ones. Unlike the earlier ventures in the Americas, there was now no expectation of retreat. France had committed itself fully. Roads were built where ancient tracks had once shifted with the seasons. The reach of the administration expanded into the smallest details of daily life. Laws took root, reshaping the very meaning of ownership, movement and authority. Colonization was no longer just a presence. It had become a system, one designed to endure across generations. To explain this vast expansion to the world and to itself, France embraced an idea that sounded generous in speech, yet carried a heavy, silent weight. The mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. It was presented as a high moral purpose, the belief that French culture, the French language, and French institutions were a gift that could guide others toward progress. Schools were opened where children were taught to speak of our ancestors, the Gauls. Curricula were reshaped. Local customs were adjusted to fit the French mould. Authority was carefully framed as instruction rather than domination, as guidance rather than mere control. Yet beneath the lofty language of the mission lay a very clear hierarchy. French values stood above all others. Local traditions were permitted only so long as they did not interfere with the machinery of the state. Equality was a word spoken often in Parisian salons, but it was rarely experienced on the ground in the colonies. The mission promised inclusion while carefully maintaining a distance. It promised progress while preserving a deep systemic imbalance. Across Africa and eventually into Southeast Asia, this pattern repeated with clinical precision. Expansion followed administration. Authority followed the explanation. Treaties spoke softly of protection, while power settled in firmly. Colonies were no longer seen as peripheral outposts. They became central to France's sense of its own purpose in the modern world. France no longer hesitated at the horizon. This second colonial empire was built with the cold confidence of bureaucracy and a belief in its own permanence. It expanded through careful design, drawing borders on maps long before the communities living there were ever consulted. Futures were redirected without invitation, steered by the needs of a distant capital. And yet, beneath the polished appearance of order, quiet tensions were already beginning to form. For those living under French rule, the promises of civilization arrived alongside the very real loss of land, autonomy, and voice. What the reports described as progress frequently felt like displacement. What was presented as guidance felt, to many, like an attempt at erasure. The Second French Colonial Empire had begun, stronger, wider, and more deeply embedded than anything that had come before. But in choosing to build a system of permanence over a relationship of partnership, France was planting seeds it could not yet see, seeds that would one day press upward through the heavy, carefully laid structures of the empire. For now, the empire continued to grow. It was confident, it was structured, and it was entirely certain of its own destiny, unaware of just how fragile certainty can become when it's finally tested by time and the human spirit. As the Second French Colonial Empire expanded, Africa became its center of gravity. What had begun with the fall of Algiers spread outward like ink on parchment, slowly, steadily, and without apology. It linked together the high, sun-bleached dunes of the Sahara, the jagged coasts of the Atlantic, the dense, humid forests of the equator, and the vast savannas of the interior, all under a single imperial vision. On the maps spread across tables in Paris, the continent appeared orderly. It was a patchwork of neat colours and confident labels. Borders were drawn with straight edges and ink, forming clean, logical shapes that seemed to align with a grand purpose. From a distance of 3,000 miles, it looked balanced, it looked complete. But on the ground, beneath the shadow of those maps, it felt very different. In North Africa, the weight of French authority settled in and began to harden. Algeria was no longer just a possession. It was the cornerstone. It was governed as if it were an extension of France itself, divided into departments, just like the land across the Mediterranean. But this permanence came at a price. Land that had been held by families for centuries passed into new hands through laws written in offices they would never visit. Settlers arrived in steady waves from Europe, carrying with them expectations of vineyards and stone houses, oblivious to the ancient rhythms of the land they now claimed. Indigenous communities were pushed toward the margins, reshaped by regulations that favoured the newcomer and slowly eroded the customs of the past. Change did not arrive with a shout. It entered daily life through the quiet closing of a gate, the restriction of movement, and the slow erasure of ancestral memory. Landscapes that had once held deep traditional meaning were redefined by the clinical language of administration. Nearby, Tunisia and Morocco were drawn into this orbit under the softer name of protectorates. Treaties were signed that spoke of stability and protection, allowing local rulers to remain on their thrones. But as the years passed, the space in which those rulers could actually move narrowed. The real decisions about taxes, about land, about the future shifted quietly into the back rooms of colonial offices. It was a layered kind of governance, familiar faces on the surface, but a distant absolute authority beneath. Further south and west, the empire's reach extended even farther into the vast expanses of West and Equatorial Africa. Here, the expansion happened with a clinical bureaucratic speed. Administrators arrived with maps in their satchels, but little understanding of the societies they were meant to govern. Borders were drawn with a terrifying confidence, slicing directly across ancient trade paths, shared languages, and kinship ties that had existed for 1,000 years. Peoples with no shared history were bound together under a single foreign authority, not for their own benefit, but for the sake of administrative efficiency. In this new order, what could be counted and moved took priority over what was lived and remembered. Resources began to flow outward in a steady, unrelenting stream. The forests were tapped for rubber. The earth was scarred for minerals. The timber was felled and hauled away. These goods moved along roads and railways that crossed the land with a singular, industrial purpose. They were not built to connect one village to another, but to connect the interior to the coast, to the ports, the steamships, and the hungry markets of Europe. Infrastructure served the needs of the empire first, and the life of the local people only incidentally. To sustain this massive machinery of extraction, the system turned to the only resource it could not do without: human labour. Compulsory labour became a feature of daily life. Men were summoned from their homes, often for months at a time, to work under conditions that many did not survive. Their hands cut through the tangled undergrowth, their backs carried the stone for the bridges, and their sweat laid the tracks for trains they would never travel freely. They carried goods they would never own toward a world they would never see. Families were thinned as the young men vanished into the work sites. Time that had once belonged to the seasons and the village now belonged to the state. The language of progress was used to soften these hard realities. Official reports in Paris spoke of development, of improvement, and of bringing light to the dark. But beneath those words lay a deeper story of exhaustion and quiet loss. Lives grew shorter. The absence of fathers and sons became a familiar ache in the villages. Resistance, of course, followed the empire wherever it went. At times it broke out into the open, uprisings that were met with a swift and decisive military response. But more often, resistance was as quiet as the empire was loud. It was found in the deliberate slowing of work. It was found in the misunderstanding of an official's instructions. It was found in the traditions that were kept alive behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the administrator. Language, belief, and identity were guarded like a fire in a storm, passed on in whispers where authority could not reach. The empire answered this quiet defiance with a firm, unblinking surveillance. The military reinforced the bureaucrat. Punishment was no longer just for the individual, but often extended to the family or the entire village. Order relied less on trust and more on the constant, heavy awareness of consequence. This was not an empire shaped by consent. It was an empire held together by the sheer weight of its own structure. From the high-ceilinged offices in Paris, the system appeared secure, rational, and well-managed. a vast machine functioning exactly as it was designed. But on the ground, it rested on a profound and growing tension. It was a tension that was carefully contained and deeply felt, but never truly absent. Africa under French rule looked immense. It looked powerful. But beneath that polished surface, the ground was already beginning to shift. Belief was thinning. Memory was accumulating. Quiet resistance was learning the value of patience. The empire stood firm in its form, but its spirit was already hollowed by the weight of the very people it sought to master. While Africa formed the physical backbone of the empire, its eastern reach extended toward the ancient mist-covered landscapes of Asia. Here, in the region that would become known as French Indochina, colonial rule took on a quieter, more intricate and more cerebral form. Indochina did not emerge from a single catastrophic battle, nor was it transformed overnight by a royal decree. Instead, it was assembled piece by piece, like a complex mechanism. The kingdoms of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, each possessing its own centuries-old history, its own sacred memory and its own unique cultural rhythm, were folded together under a single artificial colonial system. For the sake of a distant administration in Paris, this vast diversity was simplified. Difference was catalogued, arranged into folders, and managed by a growing army of bureaucrats who sought to order the world rather than to understand it. From the outside, the structure appeared remarkably calm. In Indochina, control arrived less through the spectacle of marching boots and more through the systems that settled into the quiet corners of daily life. Authority moved through government offices, tax regulations, and railway schedules. It became a familiar, predictable presence. It was the stamp on a document, the toll on a bridge, and the ringing of a school bell. It was an empire that didn't always need to display its force because it had successfully embedded itself into the very clockwork of society. At the heart of this order was a system of profound economic redirection. The land was reorganized, not to feed the villages, but to serve the insatiable needs of the imperial treasury. Fields that had for generations provided rice for local families were redirected toward the export markets of Europe. Production was forced beyond the needs of subsistence. In the north, the earth was opened for the dark coal of the Tonkin mines. Along the rivers and the newly paved roads, rubber and tea plantations spread like a green tide. Wealth moved outward in a steady, reliable flow, while the local populations bore the crushing weight of high taxes, strict labour quotas, and the constant demand for more output. The system functioned with a cold, industrial smoothness, but it functioned with a devastating unevenness. The benefits flowed upward toward the colonial elite and outward toward the ports of France. The burdens, meanwhile, settled downward into the soil and inward into the lives of the peasants. Order was visible in the grand architecture of Hanoi and Saigon, yet opportunity remained a narrow, guarded door. The machinery of empire turned efficiently, its gears greased by the sweat of a population that remained largely invisible to those at the top. Alongside this economic grip came a more subtle form of domination, the capture of the mind. The French language entered the classrooms, replacing ancient scripts and local dialects in the halls of power. French history was taught as if it were a universal human inheritance, its stories of kings and revolutions presented as the only path towards civilization. Local traditions, faiths and memories were tolerated only when they posed no challenge to the colonial office. They were repositioned as secondary, quaint customs allowed to exist in the background but never permitted to lead. Education became a selective, sharpened tool. A small local elite was trained with meticulous care to serve the colonial machine. They were taught to speak, write, and think like the French, educated enough to translate orders and administer the bureaucracy, but never fully trusted with the keys to the kingdom. They stood close enough to power to feel its heat, but they were never allowed to touch it. For many of these students, this position did not create loyalty. It sharpened their awareness. They saw the system from the inside. They understood its limits, and they began to notice its cracks. Ideas began to move through Indochina with a quiet, persistent energy. National identity, nourished by centuries of local tradition, found a new and dangerous language through exposure to the very European concepts France sought to promote. The principles of reason, the rights of man, and the promise of progress, the pillars of the Enlightenment, began to undermine French authority in practice. The lessons intended to justify the empire were being transformed into the tools for questioning it. In the quiet libraries and the candlelit study circles of the lycées, words learned from French textbooks were being repurposed for a dream of independence. A new nationalist movement began to form, not with a shout and not all at once. It grew in private conversations between teachers and students. It grew in the shared frustrations of workers in the mines and the plantations. It grew in the careful exchange of banned pamphlets and secret ideas. Writers and thinkers began to imagine a future that was not defined by a colonial administrator's report, a future shaped by their own memory and their own resolve. Resistance did not yet announce itself with the fire of open war. It waited. French authority remained firm. The administration continued its work with the same predictable rhythm. Exports flowed out of the ports. The appearance of order remained perfectly intact. The roads were maintained. The offices opened promptly every morning. The reports were filed on time in Paris. And yet, belief, the most fragile and essential foundation of any empire, was slowly fading away. Indochina was not erupting, but it was listening, it was learning, it was remembering who it was before the maps were redrawn. In that quiet, patient watchfulness, the future was already taking its own shape, waiting for the moment when the silence would finally be broken. By the early years of the 20th century, the French colonial empire had reached its widest span. It had become a global entity of staggering proportions. From the shimmering, quiet heat of the North African deserts to the emerald gloom of the Central African forests, from Caribbean islands carved by hurricane winds to the humid, silt-rich river valleys of Indochina, French authority was no longer a dream, it was a global fact. Distance, which had once been the greatest enemy of the king, no longer felt vast. The oceans had been transformed into predictable pathways. Steam engines and strict telegraph schedules made the far away feel reachable in a matter of days. On nearly every inhabited continent, the blue, white and red of the tricolor-marked lands governed by a city thousands of miles across the sea. On the maps of the era, the empire appeared immense and unshakable. Clean, bold lines connected disparate cultures and distant climates into a single, unified imperial vision. Names were arranged in elegant script as if they had always belonged together. Trade routes moved steadily across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans like the pulse of a living thing. Resources, ivory, rubber, silk and gold, travelled outward in long, predictable flows. In quiet offices, administrators ruled over populations they would never truly meet, their lives measured by the rhythmic thud of rubber stamps, the scratching of fountain pens, and the relentless pressure of deadlines. From the centre, France had become once again a global power of the first rank. This was the empire at its absolute height. In the streets of Paris, this vastness was celebrated as the ultimate proof of national vitality. It was evidence that France remained a titan in a world that was modernizing at a dizzying pace. Newspapers carried names like Brazzaville, Djibouti, and Pondicherry into the casual conversations of Parisian cafes. In classrooms across the country, maps were hung where students learned to recognize the specific French pink or French purple that claimed a third of the African continent as their own. The empire did not feel like a collection of separate stolen places. It was presented as a single glorious extension of French purpose. The peak of this spectacle was found in the grand colonial exhibitions. Grand halls were filled with carefully staged dioramas of distant lands. Visitors moved slowly through these displays, pausing before reconstructed African villages or Indo-Chinese temples, reassured by the sight of an empire that looked orderly, purposeful, and entirely justified. Artifacts were placed safely behind glass, stripped of their original meaning. Photographs fixed the people of the colonies into roles that felt simple and timeless. The empire was displayed as a completed work of art, calm, majestic, and inevitable. The language of mission and progress offered a comfortable blanket for the French conscience. It suggested that administration was the same as order, that guidance was the same as improvement, and that control could be mistaken for care. Yet, this entire structure of confidence rested on the safety of distance. Far from the gilded halls of Paris, the empire felt entirely different. In the actual villages and the bustling ports, French rule was not experienced as a grand vision, but as a daily, grinding pressure. Authority appeared not in the form of a philosophy, but in the small, inescapable details of life. Taxes gathered without the possibility of discussion, labour demanded by schedules set in a different time zone, and rules enforced by men in white uniforms who did not belong to the land they walked upon. The empire asked for absolute compliance, and in return it expected a profound silence. Beneath that surface of apparent order, a quiet unease was spreading like dampness through wood. In Africa, resentment deepened under systems that extracted the very lifeblood of the land, the rubber and the minerals, without ever returning the wealth to the people who produced it. The roads and railways that cut through the ancient landscape were not built to connect neighbours. They were built to move the harvest to the coast as quickly as possible. Administrators spoke of stability, while local communities adjusted to the total disruption of their ancestral laws. The rhythm of village life was broken by obligations that came from an outside world that did not care for the local seasons. In Indochina, the machinery of rule turned smoothly, but the belief in it was thinning to a thread. National identity was maturing behind the layers of French bureaucracy. Education had produced understanding, and understanding had produced 1,000 quiet questions. These questions didn't always become speeches or protests, not yet. Often they became something more dangerous, a watchfulness, a careful, cold patience. The empire was vast, but it was not settled. It was a giant with feet of clay. Resistance often took subtle, invisible forms, a deliberate delay in a shipment, a quiet refusal to speak the colonial tongue when the administrator left the room, the fierce preservation of a secret ritual or a traditional name when everything else felt pressured to change. People adapted because adaptation was a requirement for survival, but beneath that mask of compliance lived an undying awareness. The high-minded language of civilization rang hollow to those who lived beneath a system of permanent inequality and constant oversight. France governed many lands, but as the 20th century dawned, it was becoming clear that it did not truly belong to any of them. At its greatest extent, the empire appeared secure, strong in size, confident in its appearance, and breathtaking in its reach. And yet, beneath the surface of the map, history had already begun to turn. A world that looks calm from the height of an airplane can feel incredibly tense when you are walking its streets. An empire that seems permanent when drawn in ink can feel terrifyingly fragile in the lives of the people beneath it. The French colonial empire stood at its height, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, It was already beginning to buckle under the weight of what was coming next. The silence of the colonies was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a long, deep breath being held before a storm. When war returned to Europe in the summer of 1914, it returned with a violence that ignored all previous restraints. The conflict that would become known as the First World War did not just move borders, it consumed nations whole. In the north of France, the earth itself was transformed. Fertile fields became jagged scars of grey mud and barbed wire. Forests were splintered into toothpicks by artillery fire. The old certainty of the grand century vanished beneath a permanent shroud of coal smoke, mustard gas, and human exhaustion. France found itself fighting for its very survival on its own soil, drawn into a grinding machinery of attrition that left nothing untouched. And when the mother country called, the empire answered. From the sun-baked plains of West Africa, the mountain villages of Indochina, and the vibrant islands of the Caribbean, men were summoned to a war they did not start, for a land most had never seen. Orders travelled outward with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Names were read aloud in village squares. Hard wooden benches in troop trains were filled. Giant steamships pulled away from docks in Dakar and Saigon, their hulls packed with men being carried away from the familiar heat and colour of their homes toward a grey, wintry land that existed in their minds only as a distant legendary idea. They crossed oceans to fight on a ground that felt entirely alien. These soldiers, the tirailleurs sénégalais, the Moroccan zouaves, and the labourers from Annam, arrived in a landscape of biting sleet and frozen mud. Many had never felt the sting of a European winter before. Few had been given a true choice in the matter. Scratchy wool uniforms in horizon blue were issued. Languages collided in the camps, and complex military instructions were followed without the luxury of explanation. They arrived quietly, but their presence was unmistakable. On the front lines, the rigid hierarchies of the empire began to melt away in the heat of battle. Fear, it turned out, spoke the same language in every tongue. The thick, clinging mud of the Somme and Verdun erased the origins of every man it touched. Hunger blurred the lines of identity. In the light of the flares, colonial soldiers endured the same sleepless nights, the same choking air of the gas attacks, and the same relentless, terrifying danger as the men from Paris or Lyon. They stood in the same flooded trenches, waited under the same iron sky, and learned the same agonizing patience demanded by modern industrial war. Their sacrifice became the very foundation upon which the French victory was built. Yet, as the guns fell silent, recognition remained a hollow thing. In the aftermath, France spoke loudly of its gratitude. Speeches were made in the shadow of newly built monuments, and words like loyalty and heroism were chosen with great care. There were measured promises of reform and hints of a new equality. The empire suggested gently, almost hopefully, that the shared blood of the trenches might finally change the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. The cost, however, was immense and impossible to quantify. Lives were lost in numbers that the human mind struggled to hold. In villages from the Senegal River to the Mekong Delta, families mourned sons who would never return. Their absence felt as a permanent aching void in communities thousands of miles from the front lines. Resources flowed endlessly toward Europe. Grain, minerals and timber were stripped from lands already under heavy strain. The war had demanded everything the empire had to give, and the empire had provided it. When the war finally ended in 1918, the church bells of France rang out in victory, the streets filled with people celebrating survival. But the empire now stood exposed in a way it had never been before. Those who returned home carried more than just physical scars. They carried a new, sharpened awareness. They had seen the great France not as an untouchable ideal, but as a place, wounded, vulnerable, and deeply human. They had watched French cities burn and French armies falter. They had heard the desperate promises of equality spoken in the mud of the trenches, when survival mattered far more than social hierarchy. And then they waited. But the promised reform came with the speed of a glacier, if it came at all. Equality remained a conditional thing, a reward always kept just out of reach. The heavy bureaucratic structures of the empire endured, largely unchanged by the sacrifice of the millions. The colonial offices reopened their doors, the old rules resumed their rhythm, and authority settled back into its familiar rigid shape. The grand words of gratitude faded into the grey routine of administration. The promises were not loudly broken, they were simply quietly set aside. What remained, however, was memory. Disappointment began to harden into a cold, focused resentment. The war had revealed a truth that was now impossible to ignore. The empire was willing to demand the ultimate sacrifice, but it was not yet willing to surrender an ounce of its power. Loyalty had been proven in blood. Equality had been denied in ink. The seeds of a new kind of resistance took root in the hearts of those returning veterans. They did not rise up immediately. There were no sudden declarations or immediate breaks with the past. Instead, the change settled deep. It was nourished by shared experience, by quiet comparisons made in the barracks, and by long solitary reflection. The men who had stood together against the steel rain of the Western Front returned home changed. They remembered exactly what had been promised in the dark, and they saw exactly what was being withheld in the light. The cost of empire had been paid in full, and the bill had not gone unnoticed. The world was no longer the same, and the silence of the colonies would never again be mistaken for peace. The Second World War did not arrive for France with the slow, mounting pressure of the previous generation. It arrived with the suddenness of a world losing its breath. In the early summer of 1940, the unthinkable happened. France, a nation that had for centuries been regarded as one of the great titans of Europe, was defeated with a speed that left the global community in a state of shock. In just 6 weeks, the mighty French army was forced into a chaotic retreat. The roads of the countryside were choked with refugees fleeing the advance, and the inconceivable occurred. Paris fell. The city that had once spoken with the unwavering voice of a global empire was suddenly silenced, its authority scattered into fragments, and its future handed over to the whims of an occupier. Across the world, the news travelled like a physical blow. In the colonies, in the markets of Algiers, the streets of Saigon, and the ports of Dakar, people listened to the radio and read the headlines with a new, piercing clarity. For generations, the very foundation of French rule had rested on a powerful, almost religious belief, the idea that France was physically and spiritually unbreakable. Even when French rule was hated or questioned, its authority had always appeared secure. The empire relied not just on the strength of its cannons, but on a psychological contract of confidence. The quiet assumption that French power, once established, was an enduring fact of nature. Now, that contract was torn to pieces. The questions that rose from the colonies were simple, devastating, and impossible to answer. If France cannot defend its own capital, what meaning does its protection carry for us? If the very centre of the empire can be occupied and humiliated, what true authority does it hold at its distant edges? The deep-seated faith in French invincibility began to dissolve. The empire had always demanded a high price for its presence, absolute loyalty, unthinking obedience, and the constant, sacrifice of local resources and lives. In exchange, it had claimed to offer a shield of stability and a modern order. World War II shattered that exchange. The promise of security vanished in the smoke of the 1940 defeat, and with it, the moral weight that had allowed imperial rule to feel inevitable. In Africa and Asia, people watched the spectacle of French weakness unfold with a perspective they had never been allowed to have before. The empire no longer seemed like a distant, semi-divine force of civilization. It seemed vulnerable, it seemed fallible. Above all, it seemed human. The colonial administrations continued to function, but something essential had shifted in the air. Orders were still typed out on official stationery. The government offices still opened their doors at the same hour. The tricolor flag still flew over the governor's mansions. Yet beneath that thin veneer of routine, the certainty had drained away. Authority now felt thinner, more brittle, and dangerously exposed. Resistance movements, which had previously lived in the shadows of society, began to draw a new kind of strength. Some of these groups had existed for years, shaped by the grinding inequality of colonial life, but they had always been held back by the belief that France was too strong to be challenged. Now, that illusion was gone. The war revealed a truth that had been felt for a long time but rarely spoken aloud, that imperial authority did not depend on destiny or cultural superiority, but on the simple, fleeting circumstance of power. The defeat of 1940 removed the paralyzing idea that resistance was futile. The myth died, and in its place was a cold, new realism. Even the colonial soldiers, men who were once again called upon to fight for a France that was now divided between the Vichy regime and de Gaulle's Free French, saw the cracks in the armour. They had marched beneath the banners of an empire they believed was permanent. Now they watched that same empire fracture into competing factions, arguing over the scraps of a fallen nation. The administrators who had once ruled with a calm, unshakable confidence now found themselves uncertain, caught between conflicting orders from a distant, broken home. The empire still existed in the world of documents and decrees, but its psychological foundation, the part that lives in the mind of the governed, had cracked beyond repair. The war reshaped more than just the borders on a map. It reshaped the very nature of belief. Power no longer felt like an act of God. Obedience no longer felt like a natural law. Empire, which had for so long been sustained by the sheer assumption of its right to exist, now required an explanation. And as the conflict neared its end, the French colonial empire was no longer held together by reverence or fear alone. It stood exposed, relying increasingly on the raw use of force rather than the quiet weight of legitimacy. France would eventually emerge from the darkness of the war. Its cities would be reclaimed, its sovereignty would be restored, and the bells of the liberation would ring out from the towers of Notre Dame. But the empire would not emerge renewed. World War II didn't end French colonial rule in a single day, but it made its continuation impossible to imagine in the old way. Authority, once assumed as a birthright, now had to be defended at every turn, and in the history of nations, once authority must be defended by force, it is already beginning to fade. The shattering had begun, and the pieces would never quite fit together again. After the Second World War, France returned to its empire carrying the heavy, invisible weight of both defeat and recovery. The nation itself had survived occupation and humiliation, and now the work of rebuilding was everywhere. In the cities, the rubble was being cleared. In the capital, institutions were desperately trying to restore the old order. On the surface, France was standing again, appearing to the world as a victor. But the empire it returned to was no longer the one it had left in 1939. The structures of colonial rule, the limestone offices, the intricate laws, the vast administrations, were carefully rebuilt and restaffed. Yet the silent belief that had once sustained them had fractured beyond repair. Authority no longer felt like a natural law of the universe. It no longer rested on the quiet habits of obedience. Now, it had to be asserted with a loud voice, defended with a heavy hand, and constantly maintained at a staggering cost. And that maintenance led, inevitably, to war. In the humid, high-canopy forests of Southeast Asia, the first great rupture appeared. Indochina, which for decades had been governed through the clinical rhythm of paperwork and economic extraction, became the setting for an open and unrelenting resistance. For years, the colonial order had been preserved by the vast distance from Paris and the predictable routine of the bureaucracy. But beneath that calm surface, nationalist movements like the Viet Minh had been growing in the shadows. They were strengthened by a shared memory of what had been lost, shaped by the very education France had provided, and sharpened by the sight of imperial weakness during the dark years of the World War. When they finally spoke, they did not ask for a seat at the table or a minor reform of the tax laws. They asked for something absolute: independence. The First Indochina War unfolded slowly, almost cautiously at first. The familiar open battlefields of Europe were replaced by dense emerald jungles and remote mountain villages. There were no clear fronts, no sweeping cavalry charges, and no swift conclusions. Instead, the conflict was defined by a brutal kind of patience. It was a war of endurance rather than spectacle. French forces held the cities, the ports, and the main roads, the visible symbols of a control that looked impressive on a map. But the resistance moved through the countryside like the weather, supported by local belief and the long memory of the people. Authority existed only where a soldier stood with a rifle. It vanished the moment he turned his back. Time worked steadily against the empire. Each passing year thinned the resources of a France that was still trying to rebuild its own homes. Victory became a word that was harder and harder to define. Control existed only in fragments, never as a whole. The war did not feel decisive, it felt wearing. A heavy fatigue settled into the spirit of the French military. Soldiers rotated home with stories of a jungle that never ended. Administrators began to question the very purpose of a struggle that seemed to have no exit. The distance between the commands issued in Paris and the reality on the muddy ground widened into a canyon. That exhaustion finally gathered in a remote bowl-shaped valley called Dien Bien Phu. There, in 1854, France committed the heart of its strength, believing that a concentrated display of force could finally restore its fading authority. The valley was meant to be a symbol, a monument to resolve and renewed dominance. Instead, it became a place of agonizing waiting. Isolated from the coast and surrounded by the heights, the French forces endured a slow, rhythmic unraveling. Supplies thinned to nothing. Positions were weakened by constant shelling. Days passed under the unrelenting pressure of an enemy that would not go away. When the defeat finally came, it did not arrive with a sudden crash. It settled over the valley like a cold fog, clear, final, and undeniable. Dien Bien Phu was more than a military loss. It was a global signal. It proved that the empire could be challenged, outweighted, and ultimately overcome by those it sought to rule. Indochina slipped from French control, and with it went the last lingering belief that force alone could preserve the imperial dream. Authority, once shattered in the mud of a jungle valley, does not return easily. Yet, as the sun set on the empire in Asia, an even more difficult struggle was already beginning in North Africa. In Algeria, the War of Independence reached into the very heart of what it meant to be French. Unlike the distant jungles of Indochina, Algeria was woven into the fabric of the nation's identity. It was not seen as a colony, but as a part of France itself, administratively, culturally, and emotionally. To the French mind, letting go of Algeria did not feel like a strategic withdrawal. It felt like a traumatic separation of the self. The conflict that followed unsettled everything. Violence did not remain contained in the mountains or the deserts. It moved into the whitewashed streets of Algiers and eventually into the cafes of Paris. Suspicion entered the rhythm of daily life. Civilians lived beneath a constant, heavy uncertainty, never knowing where loyalty ended and danger began. The boundary between authority and excess grew increasingly, terrifyingly unclear. This war did not remain at the jagged edges of the map. It unfolded within France itself. Public life fractured. The private conscience of the nation grew uneasy. Families argued over dinner tables. Ancient institutions strained under the pressure of the conflict. What had once been justified quietly under the name of empire now demanded a loud public explanation. This became a profound moral reckoning. The methods required to maintain control, methods that had been accepted in the shadows of the colonial era for decades, now raised questions that could no longer be ignored. Could a democracy maintain control without surrendering its own principles? Could order be preserved without causing a lasting spiritual harm to the nation? Every attempt at a solution seemed only to sink the country deeper into the struggle. France hesitated, caught in a terrible vice. Withdrawal felt like a humiliating loss of identity, yet continuation felt like an unbearable weight. Every path forward carried a devastating consequence. The conflict revealed the final, tragic contradiction of the empire, that maintaining power required actions that eroded the very values, liberty and equality, that France claimed to defend. In time, the cost became impossible to ignore. Lives were lost, trust between the people and the state dissolved, and the old certainty of the civilizing mission vanished. The war no longer promised a restoration of the past. It promised only the prolongation of a nightmare. The wars of independence revealed what decades of quiet, hidden resistance had long prepared. An empire cannot endure once the belief in its right to rule has faded from the hearts of both the ruler and the ruled. Authority sustained only by fear cannot outlast the human desire for self-determination. By the end of these long, draining conflicts, France stood fundamentally changed. The empire that had once stretched confidently across the oceans now faced its final limits. What remained was not a triumph or a restoration of glory. It was a quiet, heavy acceptance. It was the realization that the colonial era was not just ending, but that it had to end for France to find itself again. The end did not arrive with the sudden thunder of a single moment, nor with the finality of a single battle. There was no specific date that could contain the entirety of its collapse. No decisive, world-shaking sound announced its arrival. Instead, the end of the empire came quietly, unfolding across years rather than days, as the momentum of independence moved steadily, like a rising tide, through the landscapes of Africa and Asia. What had once seemed unthinkable in the gilded offices of Paris slowly became unavoidable on the streets of the world. The empire did not fall in a dramatic heap of ruin. It receded. Across vast territories, the pattern of departure repeated itself with subtle, local variations. Hard military campaigns were gradually replaced by the scratch of fountain pens in quiet negotiation rooms. Sharp commands were replaced by long, late-night conversations. Declarations of sovereignty followed decades of resistance that had rarely been acknowledged, allowed by the governors, but had lived in the hearts of the people all along. One colony after another stepped forward, no longer identifying as a possession, but as a nation. New flags, vibrant with greens, yellows and reds, were raised where the French tricolor had once flown alone. Their colours felt unfamiliar at first, sharp and bright against the sky, but they were gradually accepted as the new reality of the world. For France, each of these moments carried a different emotional weight. Some departures came through mutual agreement, shaped by careful, diplomatic language and quiet signatures on thick parchment. Others arrived through sheer exhaustion, after years of a struggle that had drained the certainty and the treasure from both sides of the ocean. In some places, independence felt like the rush of a long-awaited breath, a deep relief. In others, it arrived with a heavy hesitation, shadowed by the uncertainty of what would come next and the unanswered questions of a shared past. The empire did not end in a glorious triumph, nor did it end in a total crushing catastrophe. It ended through a long, halting process of letting go, a process that was uneven, incomplete, and deeply emotional for everyone involved. In Africa, new states emerged from within the very borders that had been drawn by colonial rulers with straight edges and ink generations before. Names were reclaimed. Capitals like Leopoldville and Salisbury redefined themselves. New leaders stepped onto the world stage, carrying both the radiant hope of their people and the heavy burden of history. They faced the staggering task of building modern nations from within structures that had never been designed for independence. Freedom had arrived, but it arrived alongside immense challenge. Sovereignty came with a profound responsibility. The future opened wide, but the path through it was not always clear. In Asia, the separation had already moved into its final phases. The departure from Indochina had marked the true turning point, making it clear to the world that the age of European empire had finally passed its zenith. What followed elsewhere was not a surprise, but a confirmation. The world had shifted on its axis, and the old concept of empire simply no longer fit within the new reality. The lowering of the tricolor flag became a quiet, repetitive ritual. There were no grand, global ceremonies broadcast to every corner of the earth. Often it happened without crowds or the sound of a cheering multitude. A flag was carefully folded, a heavy oak office door was closed for the last time, a steamship waited in a harbour, its engines humming in the morning mist. Administrators departed with their files. Soldiers boarded transports with their kits. Authority did not end with a grand announcement, it ended with a profound absence. The empire gave way to memory. For France, the end felt less like a sudden loss and more like a difficult transformation. The nation turned inward once more, reassessing its place in a world that was no longer shaped by the rigid hierarchy of the colonial era. Influence remained. It lived on through the French language, through diplomacy, and through the thousands of human connections that could not be severed by a treaty, but it was no longer absolute. Power no longer travelled across the globe in the same way. The French colonial empire had spanned centuries. It had risen through the curiosity of the early explorers and the smell of pine tar. It had hardened through the clinical control of the bureaucrats, and it had eventually unravelled through the persistent resistance of those who refused to be ruled. Its end did not erase its impact. The languages endured in the schools and the markets. The borders, for better or worse, remained. The histories of millions carried the imprint of the empire long after the last flag was lowered into its box. Lives continued to be shaped by decisions made in another age, by men who were now only names in a record book. But the era itself was over. An empire that once stretched across every ocean and every inhabited continent now existed only in the yellowed records of the archives, in the recollections of the elderly, and in the lives of those shaped by its presence, often quietly and almost always unevenly. It ended not with the thunder of a final cannon, but with the silence of an empty office and a folded flag. And in that silence, the modern world, complex, fractured and free, began to take its own shape, began to When the flags were finally lowered and the last of the administrators boarded their ships, the empire did not simply vanish into the sea. It remained, not as a living authority, but as a ghost haunting the landscapes, the languages, and the very lives of millions. History does not wash away with the tide. It leaves behind a sediment, a layer of stone and memory that continues to shape the ground we walk upon. The end of French rule was a political fact, but the influence it left behind was a much deeper, more persistent reality. Across the vast stretches of Africa and the river valleys of Asia, the borders remained. These lines had been drawn decades earlier by men in quiet, sunlit rooms in Paris. Men who often had never felt the heat of the Sahara or heard the rush of the Mekong. They used straight edges and ink to divide a continent, often with little understanding of the ancient communities, the shared languages, or the kinship ties they were slicing through. Independence did not erase these ink lines. The new nations inherited them, along with the heavy strain they carried. In some places, these borders became silent scars, points of tension where old divisions resurfaced under new names. The geometric outlines of an empire that no longer existed continued to dictate where a person could travel, where a farmer could graze his herd, and where a nation's reach ended. The empire itself was gone, but its skeletal design endured, firmly etched into the earth. Language, however, travelled even farther than the colonial armies ever had. Today, the French language remains a living presence across continents. It is heard in the bustling marketplaces of Dakar, in the quiet government offices of Libreville, and in the hurried conversations of students in Hanoi. For some, the language became a bridge, a tool for connection that opened paths to a wider world and new opportunities. For others, the sound of the tongue remains a complicated reminder of a time when their own stories were interrupted and reshaped by an outside force. It is a language that carries both the weight of the past and the breath of the future. Culture too moved in both directions, flowing across the oceans like a persistent tide. French influence left its mark on the law codes, the art, and the very architecture of former colonies, the limestone prefectures and the iron railway stations that still stand as silent witnesses to another age. At the same time, the empire fundamentally reshaped France itself. The music, the literature, and the flavours of the colonies crossed the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, settling quietly into the rhythm of daily life in Paris and Marseille. The scent of cumin and coriander in a French market, the rise of North African literature in Parisian bookstores. These were not just imports. They were the transformation of France itself. Independence did not erase these exchanges. It simply turned them into a new shared heritage. Yet beneath these visible connections lay the unresolved wounds of the past. The empire had been built on the extraction of land, the exploitation of labour, and the taking of lives. These are not easy histories to face, and often a heavy silence was used to replace a true acknowledgement of what had happened. Memory became a contested ground, held one way by those who had ruled from the gilded centres of power, and another by those who had lived beneath the pressure of that rule. The legacy of the French colonial empire is not a single, simple story. It is a shared inheritance, but it is a deeply uneven one. It carries the pride of expansion alongside the pain of displacement, the opportunity of connection alongside the injustice of inequality. The former colonies began to build their own futures while carrying the physical and psychological weight of a past they did not choose. France, too, continues to struggle with an identity shaped by both its grand ambitions and the harm those ambitions caused. The empire left behind no simple inheritance. Instead, it left a world of profound complexity, a world linked by a common history, shaped by the memory of power, and still learning, day by day, how to live with the lingering echoes of that reach. The story did not end when the last ship left the harbour. It continued, and it continues still, in the lives of the millions who inherited a past they cannot escape, but which they are finally free to reshape into something of their own. And in that quiet, persistent continuation, the true, complicated legacy of the empire endures. The empire faded, but it did not fall into a total silence. When the era of colonies drew to its close, the world did not simply reset to a previous state. History did not close its heavy pages and begin a clean new chapter. Instead, the French colonial empire thinned out and spread. It dissolved into quieter, more domestic forms, into the small habits of daily life, into the rigid structures of modern institutions, and into the complicated, enduring web of human relationships and memory. Influence remained. Though it no longer carried a sword, it lives today in the shared cadence of languages spoken thousands of miles from the cafes of Paris. It lives in the legal codes and the school systems of distant capitals, still shaped by the architectural logic of French thought. It lives in the very bones of the cities, in the roads, the railways, and the stone foundations that were laid in another age, by men who believed they were building for eternity. The empire no longer issues, commands, but it continues to connect. Memory, however, lingers, uneven, heavy, and unresolved. For some, the imperial past is recalled as a story of grand expansion and monumental achievement, a time when France's reach was as wide as the world itself. For others, that same history is a chronicle of profound loss and a denial of dignity. These two memories do not cancel each other out. They exist side by side, sometimes in the same city, sometimes in the same heart, shaping identity in vastly different ways, on vastly different shores. France, long after the last governor returned home, continues to search for its own reflection in this past. Centuries of overseas power had deeply shaped how the nation understood its place in the world. Letting go of that power required more than just the signing of a treaty or the lowering of a flag. It required a reckoning. The questions of history, of responsibility, and of who truly belongs to the story of France continue to echo through public life. These questions are carried forward by new generations who have inherited both the pride of the old dream and the quiet pain of its reality. In the former colonies, independence opened new, sunlit paths, but it also brought new, heavy burdens. These nations began to chart their own futures while navigating the borders, the languages, and the administrative systems that were left behind like a complicated inheritance. The relationship with France has evolved over the decades, sometimes cooperative and warm, sometimes strained and cold, but it is almost always shaped by the memory of what came before, even when the eyes are fixed firmly on the future. The empire is no longer visible on the map. The bold, French pink lines have been replaced by the colours of sovereign nations, but it is still present. It appears in the moments of unexpected connection, and in the sudden sparks of friction. It lives in a shared literary culture, and in the silence of unresolved wounds. It is found in the quiet, almost invisible ways the past continues to inform the present. In the law, in the architecture, and in the very way people move through their world. The French colonial empire did not vanish into the sea. It dissolved. It melted into the lives, the borders, and the memories of the modern world. And in that dissolution, its story continues. It is no longer a story written by the authority of a king or a president, but by the millions of people who live with its legacy every day. It is a story of how the world was once redrawn, and how we are still learning to live within those lines. And so, the timeline continues, not as an empire, but as a shared and complicated history.